Good afternoon and welcome to IAB There, our weekly video show in which we connect the digital advertising ecosystem. I'm Zoe Soon, Vice President of the Experience Center here at IAB, and I'm excited to talk to Jonathan Stringfield today, Vice President, Global Business Research and Marketing at Activision Blizzard. Welcome, Jonathan.
Zoe, really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining us. And you've written a great book called Get in the Game.
I have indeed, and what a great way to showcase. If you just keep that in frame, that'd be perfect.
So, I mean, I'd love to chat to you about why you wrote this book, what people can expect about this book, but maybe we can start out with you telling us a little about who you are and your role at Activision, just so we get to know you a bit.
Yeah, for sure. And as you might suspect, the two topics are pretty well connected. So at Activision Blizzard, I oversee a few teams largely related to measurement research, insights, and business marketing for a B2B offering. So essentially anything that has to do with game advertising, sponsorships, corporate alliances, esports, things of that nature. So long and short, my day job, I spend a lot of time going out and speaking with top brands about what makes sense about gaming and why they should be interested in the gaming ecosystem and what have you. My night job, I'm an academic sociologist who's spent most of his career looking at, how individuals use technologies like social media or otherwise to find meaning, make connections, have some degree of social connectivity. So between the two, what I found is, in ongoing conversations with brands and, taking a look at work that I'd done previously at social networks like Facebook and Twitter, the quality of the conversation that we'd be having with advertisers wasn't quite there. And I think a lot of it had to do with there being a bit of a knowledge gap in terms of where the overall marketing community was for platforms like social media relative to something like gaming. So to kind of fill that gap, it made a lot of sense to start to make some baseline materials, and hence wrote an entire book about how advertisers and marketers can think about and integrate into the gaming ecosystem.
So you're sort of intersecting your gaming and sociology expertise with your brand and business expertise. And
on that backdrop of working with brands on what makes sense for them in new technologies and how do you learn about them, right? Because the same conversations I think we're having in early days at platforms like Facebook and Twitter is kind of where we're at with gaming, right? So I think there's like that healthy need to kind of understand the demographics, the use cases, how folks orient themselves towards it. But given the size and scope and complexity of gaming, quite a bit more complicated. So having some of these baseline materials and whatnot really felt like it'd be useful.
And I think that's an interesting distinction, right? As opposed to the social platforms, which sort of grew at a relatively even pace between user base and businesses working a use case for it. Gaming has been around for decades, and it's only sort of now that it's starting to get more momentum. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, it is certainly the case that, both gaming and esports have been around some 50, 60 some odd years, depending on, where you want to kind of put the beginning of it. But, throughout that time, I think the opportunities for marketers was always a little uneven. So to be clear, there were opportunities for advertising very early on in games, like back in the days of Atari, right? The issue was that they just didn't really conform to how marketers like to buy things or think about ad placements or what have you. So nowadays, a couple of things have shifted. One, the number of game fans and people playing games has expanded so dramatically that we are talking about a medium that's reaching folks at scale, right? And at the end of the day, advertising is a game about scale, and now gaming can credibly have a number of ways to connect to very large audiences. And secondarily, these games are becoming that much more internet connected, which means that there's a lot more options in terms of ways in which that brands can potentially integrate outside of just being hard-coded into the game. And then finally, and this is something that, I spend some time concentrating on the book to a certain degree, is that if you look at the history of gaming, there is this kind of constant flow in terms of economic pressures on game development, which is prohibitively expensive and getting more expensive, which means that game developers have had to become very good at finding flexible ways to potentially transact with customers that has really lent them towards looking at mechanisms like advertising and sponsorships and what have you as potential ways to draw in revenue. So realistically, I think what we're seeing in the modern days is that all of these factors are kind of coming to a head, combined with, and I'm sure we'll talk about, like ongoing enthusiasm around the metaverse and things like that, that is really kind of like harrowed in on marketer attention. But we're still not at the point where we have a good grasp of like, okay, sure, I get it, gaming kind of makes sense, but now what, right? That's the
Right.
piece that wasn't quite there yet.
Right. I want to recap those 3 points that you made because I think they're really good. One, it's at scale. So I think, like you said, advertising is a scale game, pun not intended. And it's sort of getting to the point where we can't afford to ignore it anymore as a channel, especially as other media fragments. There's like less opportunities. Two, you mentioned the internet and just like basically games are everywhere, not just on PC consoles. We're seeing them in more places. The third one that you mentioned is that the rising costs of developing games and just what the consumers are expecting in terms of effects and fidelity, gaming studios and more incentivized to look for additional revenue streams. And then I think you mentioned more of the socio-technical landscape changes, just like metaverse, Gen Z, all of these kind of things. And sort of those 4 things sum it up.
I think so. And you know, again, if we broadly, when we talk about the trajectory of gaming and why it got so big, you know, there's a lot of different, you know, potential reasons for it. But I think, you know, kind of those socioeconomic / historical factors are really the most important ones. That the two I tend to focus on is one, generational effects, that gaming is something that people are growing up in increasing numbers doing, right? So the heads of household today were folks that grew up with video games. It is not like a weird othered activity. This is just regular media to them, right? Like this whole distinction between gamers and non-gamers and whatnot is just something that's going to continue to break down. And candidly, I think that's healthy. And then on the other hand, you have games that, you know, by merit of the rise of mobile or what have you, are increasingly being designed for everyone, not just people that have a lot of experience playing games. So that in and of itself dramatically increased the number of people who would play games. And again, all the effects that we just talked about, right? Like those really kind of set the stage for gaming kind of coming from being, you know, a fairly niche activity that we still consider niche, even though it really hasn't been niche since like, say, the 1980s, to something that is more kind of aligned with the center of mainstream culture.
Right. And we don't say video watchers or TV watchers, right? And I predict the same thing will happen with games. Everyone will just game as part of their media diet.
Exactly. It'll just be something people do. And sure, they're like in the same way that there's cinephiles, right? There are folks that are gamers that identify, right? Like gaming is a part of their activity. And that's fine. Like that's a, to be clear, small group that I think is important to understand. And again, something that I go into in the book. But I generally throughout use the much more, you know, kind of open term of game players or game fans, because there is a distinction between those folks that really identify with gaming and gaming culture and whatnot versus people that just play games. And obviously that's the vast majority of individuals that are within the ecosystem.
And I think that's, people have tended to mistake the gaming audience for that small segment of really passionate gamers and call it niche. So going back to your book, I read it and I really enjoyed it. And the thing that I enjoyed the most is that it does, you know, you really lean on your social science, so, you know, sociology background, and talk about the cultural shifts that are happening, why gaming is a thing. And it kind of gives you a good sense of what was happening, how it was impacting cultural things. Can you maybe, for the viewers out there, explain what they can expect from your book?
Sure. I mean, you know, it is the case that throughout the book, you know, I kind of like to give that context of why gaming, because I think it's easy to kind of look at it as frivolities, and they are, but they are also something that has, since there have been video screens, there have been video games, and we have used video games to understand and explore new technologies. So that comes from the fact that like gameplay is very unique and human, and therefore playing games on these new technologies is a human way to orient ourselves towards them. So when you look at it through that light, you kind of start to understand, all right, now I get the thread of, the influence of gaming consoles on mobile, certainly on PC. There's a lot to be said. Now as we're thinking about the very future of the consumer internet, depending on how much you prescribe or not to theories and visions of the metaverse, same thing, right? Because all of these things are basically talking about how we interact with technological environments then as, kind of video games as an intermediary, soon as things like virtual worlds and, things that have been the domain of gaming here too for some 40 or 50 years. So I think understanding that kind of broader context, understanding, kind of the genesis of even things like esports and, why it's based on PCs and why it didn't really take off until streaming platforms, became more dominant, really kind of helps you wrap your head around not just broader understanding, but by merit of doing so, getting smarter about what the potential for activations are. Because I think the more that you understand a medium and where it tends to thrive or not, or why it's kind of oriented the way that it is, it allows you to kind of fast track a more generalized understanding. Because the trick with gaming is that indeed it's a huge ecosystem with numerous potential means of entry. So to really kind of wrap your head around it, understanding that context is going to kind of fast track your overall understanding of something that is going to be something you're going to have to learn as a function of time if it's something that you haven't been familiar with in the past.
Right, because I think the first question I would have is why gaming? Why don't I just increase my spend across existing channels? Why do I need to learn a new channel? And it sort of goes into some of the reasons, and also young audiences and the arc of where media consumption is going. I'd be remiss not to bring up measurement given your title and expertise. We're about to release an update to the 2009 intrinsic in-game standards. Can you believe it's been that long since they've been updated to account for 3D environments and viewability and things like that? How else do you see the rise of gaming impacting measurement?
I mean, I think there's going to be some steps here, right? So I think step one, and I think we've done a lot of this work at Activision Blizzard, and I know a lot of organizations have done the same, is that we kind of need to meet advertisers eye to eye on the ways in which they're currently measuring, right? So whether that's brand impact, your reach reporting, viewability, and what have you, that's going to become kind of the standard, at least as folks are getting oriented towards the ecosystem. But then things are going to get weird, right? Because it's exactly the things that you're talking about, like 3D environments where maybe I'm going to see a billboard or an avatar wearing an advertisement or who knows what. And again, how do you start to account for reach in those, or what's an impression and what does that mean? So I think what we're going to find is that, one might argue, and I might be one of those that would argue, that this whole concept of reach, frequency, and all of the means through which we establish TV measurement roughly around 1972 is a little long in the tooth when we're thinking about the digital world. And yet, because we as advertisers love to kind of keep standards as they are, we've kind of grafted onto that and kept that going. However, it's going to get to its end, right? So that's where I think there's really interesting conversations around attention as a metric or what have you that are more fit to a type of medium that isn't just passive, that you sit there and observe or scroll through or what have you, but you're interacting with. And I think as we're starting to think through a framework where media is no longer passive, but is much more immersive, which again, regardless of what you think of the metaverse or what have you, you can credibly believe that there is going to be a continued drive towards more immersive, interactive media in general, games or not. It'll become that much more important to think about what success looks like on the terms of those media. The payoff, I think, is that in something that we're seeing even in the kind of, brand measurement, more standardized measurement we're doing even now, is that because the media is immersive, if the messaging, if the, activation or whatnot is done right, it truly pays dividends because again, people are really paying attention because again, they're interacting directly with that environment. So there's a long way to say that, like, sure, I think at some point there inevitably has to be a little bit of a break in terms of our thinking around it, but the payoff is potentially media that is that much more effective. Again, assuming that we understand how folks are integrating in them, how they think about these environments, and all the rest of these things are going to be really important for marketers to start to understand in coming years.
You're absolutely right. Like the currency is going to change, right? The development of technology and our everything, the consumer has matured, technology has matured, and our measurement has sort of not kept pace with that. So I think, you know, it's almost like we're measuring in 2D when there's a much better KPI out there that we're not capturing. So we don't know how to
measuring an analog at this point.
Right, exactly.
So, like, I mean, we're not. I think we're even 2 steps before that, even to a certain degree.
No, totally. Like, did the I think someone made the analogy the other day. It's like a newspaper. Did the ad run? That's the impression. Was it above the fold? That's viewability, right? So we kind of need to evolve, and I think we'll eventually see gaming impact. It feels wrong to say more traditional digital media. It feels like an oxymoron, but we'll see gaming even impact video, because as green screens come through, as dynamic ad placements come, we're going to have to fall back to a different measure than what exists now.
I think so. And again, like it comes down to the fact that one way or another, there's a credible argument that can be made that like media in general is going to go towards like being more like real life, right? So, and again, regardless of how you think that's going to manifest, and there are numerous ways, and people are making bets on VR, AR, metaverse, or what have you, or gaming to that degree. That's kind of the direction, more or less, that media is kind of going. So the more that we can start to think through our measurement standards, what success looks like, and what have you in those environments, obviously, the better.
Yeah, it's not enough. Was the ad put in front of their face? Did they pay attention to it? Did they engage? Did they share? All of those measurements are much more aligned to brand receptivity, positive brand association, as opposed to, did I just annoy someone with my ad? So I think we've sort of covered where that will go for the metaverse. What are your thoughts on the metaverse? I know you're definitely pro gaming, and I tend to see two types of people, those who are sort of more traditionally pure game purists, and those who sort of see gaming as the entree to the metaverse. Whereabouts do you sit on that scale?
I mean, definitely somewhere in between, right? So again, I believe if to have a credible path to the metaverse, you kind of have to have that belief that one way or another, we want media that is more like our real life and real interactions. And again, maybe not all the time, maybe not all forms, but like generally that's the directions things are heading. So I think if you buy that, then we're going to come to the potential obstacles, right? There are numerous technical ones, right? Which I don't think we'll have the time to get into here, but all relate to how do you render these things? How do you deliver them at scale?
In real time.
Precisely. And again, I think there's some pithy potential answers that all have to do with, the advent of 5G or the proliferation of 5G, cloud computing to take out some of the computational requirements and so on and so forth, but all like fairly thorny technical problems. And again, all worthwhile to discuss, but things that I tend to leave to much more qualified voices. Where I fall in that continuum is the human element, because that one feels that much more sticky, right? Like, what is the actual value that these types of environments are going to provide to real people, right? Not just folks like you and I who are not like normal people, right? Like, we're into technology and what have you, but we're kind of different from everyday consumers that are only going to invest in the technology the extent to which that provides them value, and are only going to jump through hurdles to put on a VR helmet or AR glasses or whatever you believe is going to be.
Why will they go to the metaverse?
Precisely correct. So that's a person problem, right? And that has to do with value, and that has to do with, again, the ways in which we tend to use technology as an intermediary for our social connectivity. So in light of all that, that's where I think gaming can be extremely instructive, because again, lots of social interactivity in virtual worlds via virtual avatars and so on and so forth is happening in gaming. So I think, yes, we're many years away from metaverse. I think most folks, or at least most reasonable folks, have kind of like got on that train, that we're still talking about something that's a decade away or so. But where I really want folks to go, or where I really think the opportunity is less worrying about that in abstract because of the rather immense technical problems that we have to get over, and more starting to think about the people issues and how we can define value and how we can message them in these environments in a way that won't disrupt the experience. And again, critically, those are all things that we can pick up from gaming for now. So even if it's the case that marketers or technologists or whatnot are not interested in gaming the abstract, more interested in the potential metaverse or metaverse-like experiences, right now gaming is going to be the best game in town for folks to get that level of understanding about how to do things that are good for consumers. Because if you're not doing that, they're not just going to jump into the metaverse because it's cool tech, because people don't care.
And the same in games. If it's not good for them in the games, they're not going to interact with your brand. and I think you bring up a really good point. It's like, how do consumers want to interact and encounter your brand in the metaverse? What would be additive to their experience? I think it's a question we need to answer. Where do you think this will sort of go? Any practical advice for brands who are wanting to get started and don't really know where, like what formats are best, platforms, steps to getting started?
Yeah, I mean, in the approach that I put in the book is that really just kind of understanding at a high level strategically, these are the ways in which you can integrate with this ecosystem, right? And again, I'm careful to describe as an ecosystem because there's multiple games, publishers, ways in which folks can get into it. And again, I shy away from getting the nitty gritty or too tactical, but more, these are the avenues that you can start to put messaging in. And much of it is not going to be anything that's going to, surprise folks, as we are talking about video ads and mobile games. We're talking about sponsorships in game environments. We're talking about sport-like sponsorships in esports, or even influencer marketing along the lines of streamers or esports personalities. So if you think about it in that terms, we're not getting too far away from stuff you kind of already know about, but more applying some of your current marketing skills to a different environment. And then once you kind of get into that level of understanding of like, okay, this is the opportunity space, then you're really getting into, I think, a mode where you can start to pick out the differences, like how do individuals, again, think about immersion in video games, and how do you not break it with a message, right? Because that's the number one thing that you don't want to do in any kind of video game environment, is take folks out of the video game environment. So in other words, I think that, like so many things, it's a bit of a stepping stone of kind of relating our current marketing industry knowledge to what the opportunities are, understanding what those opportunities are, and then starting to pick through and get the knowledge of what's kind of different or special about them in these interactive environments that can then, allow folks not just to integrate with a new media, new in air quotes, media like gaming, but to integrate well.
And I think you're absolutely right. We can apply current marketing knowledge, and the additional thing that gaming sort of offers is mindset, right? You can look at the type of game they're playing. Is it a social game? Is it a solo game? Is it puzzle solving? Is it a world game? And sort of get a sense of what mindset the consumer will be in at that moment.
Inclusive of demographics and any number of indicative things. And again, I think just getting started with figuring out the where of how to integrate, what platforms, what publishers, what genres, and whatnot, that's kind of the next step that I think follows pretty easily thereafter.
Great. Okay. Any parting words for the viewers? I know you were really passionate about writing this book because you saw a gap in that marketplace. So maybe a good question to end on is, what do you hope, what was your hope in writing this book?
I mean, it's very simple, right? That there's a better understanding about the opportunities in gaming today and the value that they can provide, but then also a recognition that those skills and levels of knowledge will pay dividends in the future as we continue to think about media that becomes more interactive, whether it be the metaverse or not. So payoff today and dividends tomorrow, based upon starting to learn about gaming as it exists now.
No, they really can't afford to ignore this growing medium.
Certainly not.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you as always, Jonathan. Where can people find you and buy this book?
It's available wherever books are sold: Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, independent bookstores. So please check it out. If you do, please leave a review. Would love to hear from you, but mostly I hope folks enjoy.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure.